That would be fantastic. All right, so so this evening, our conversation is looking at the education system in Scotland, and I call this night's topic, education in Scotland, a long view. And the reason I call it a long view is, the textbook or the Divine Book focuses very heavily on the 1750s and onward, and focuses a lot on the sort of parochial local education. But I want to take it back a little bit, because one of the things that he talks about in the first, let's say, third of the chapter is sort of the importance of John Knox and the importance of the Reformation. So I think it's important for us to start there as a place for us to use as our launch pad into into the 1700s and into the 1800s, right? Because as Tom Devine says, there's no sort of avoiding the fact that there's a long trend of education within Scotland leading up to the period of the chapter. So that's where we will begin this evening. If you look at the documents that are posted in Blackboard, we have an excerpt. We have an excerpt from John Knox and the Book of Discipline, and then we also have then we have some of the documents from that are referred to in the chapter, right? The 1872 Scottish Education Act, and then others. So we'll come back to those in just a few moments. So one of the things that I have come back to quite a bit, and I have mentioned a number of times throughout this course, is the fact that Scotland had 5 universities historically, that were established, right? St. Andrews, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and then King and Marischal College. And then by the 1800s, the mid 1800s, the 2 Aberdeen universities are unified in 1860. But it's important for us to remember, right, that 5 universities in a country that had only about 1 million people up by the 1700s was quite remarkable when you consider that a place like England that had 10 times the population only had 2 universities. And one of the things that, again, Tom Devine does a really great job of talking about in the early portions of the chapter is that these were places that were really democratized. As long as you were competent and you could pay the fee, you could get admission into these universities, into these schools, and into these universities. You didn't necessarily have to be Presbyterian or Catholic or whatever the case might be.
Excuse me?
But that's not the case when you look at a place like England, right? When you look down south in England, there is prohibitions against this, right? You could not go to any of the English, either of the English universities if you were non-Anglican, Episcopalian. So that's important. Alexandra, go ahead.
To clarify, were these universities free? I know that Edinburgh University is still free to people who live in Scotland, and I think even members of the EU, but...
Great question. So no, these institutions were not free. They only become free in Scotland in the 1990s. I should know that more specifically. It's something we'll talk about in a little bit, in a couple chapters. It's in the 1980s or 1990s that they become free, and they are reduced fees for EU. So, like when I studied in the United Kingdom in the early 2000s, or in the early 2000s, I had to pay quite a bit of money because they wanted to make as much money off of a non-EU, non-Scottish person. But they're not free here. But that's actually a really important point, right? They are not free. And why is that so important? That's so important because the way that the fee structure or the fees were structured was the fees were almost like market based, right? The more popular the professor and the more popular the course, the more expensive the course would be, right? So like that encouraged one of the arguments for the Scottish Enlightenment, and one of the arguments for the Scottish institutions is that they, because of their market-based nature, this encourages the professors to be that much better. Does that make sense? Right? Because like the better you are, the more desired you are. The more desired you are, the more you can charge for your courses. And then obviously the richer that you become, if that makes sense.
So just like a follow-up question then, so like because the amount of universities were disproportionate to the amount of population, were they like a huge source of economy boost for Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, people, in one way, yes, people are coming from across Europe and across Britain to go to these institutions. But more importantly, they're places where people can make connections, right? So like those lairds that are trying to become more cosmopolitan come down to Edinburgh or go to Glasgow or go to Aberdeen, and they make connections. And then when they go back home, they use those in economic connection, they use those social connections to their economic advantage. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So in the 1500s, particularly after 1560 and the establishment of the Scottish Church, the Presbyterian Church, Scots establish a more local parish school system. So let's talk about what that means. So for those of you who are not Christian, right, a parish is just an individual church community. Each church is a parish, and by the middle of the 1500s, all parishes needed to have their own schools attached to it, where the school, where the minister of the church also acted as the major instructor for the students, right? So he had, because it was just men, he had a dual social role, or dual institutional role. Again, that's not uncommon, and that would not be seen as strange, right? Because in order to have become a religious leader, they will have had to have attended school. They will have had to have been educated. So there would have been, credentials to accompany that. But what that does is it makes education more local, meaning that students could then, that the education was more local, meaning that pretty much anybody had access to the school, right? And parishes already were sort of self-sustaining, because obviously there are, that you have to keep the minister employed anyway, and they already have a building where they can do the instruction. So it kind of made sense. So Jeffrey asked a question a moment ago, which I only just saw. This also helps the literacy rates, which is important to respect. Yeah, good, right? So the literacy rates are also important here as well. What do you mean, Melissa, that this is where catechists come from?
So, well, technically in the Catholic religion, the teachers are called catechists, and those are the ones that educate like the children once they do every, like from baptisms, every
Sure.
second.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that is true. Now these institutions would not have been Catholic, because up until about the early 1800s, Catholicism was very limited in Scotland, there was only about 2% of the population that was Catholic. These would have been predominantly Presbyterians, so there would have been less catechesis or catechisms.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's a great point. Tony, go ahead.
So this is a question on like the type of education. So
Good question. Okay.
I know that you know, Scottish what is it, the type of Protestant that was
Presbyterian. They're Presbyterian.
okay, so for Presbyterian, the Presbyterian view would, I know it's more how do I say, less religious in a way in the doctrine. So was the education given by these ministers to students, was it very religious based or was it mostly secular based?
That's an excellent question. They were predominantly religious based. The students would have been reading a lot of the Bible, particularly on in the elementary level, but there would have also been basic arithmetic. There also would have been reading of stories, right? There would have been looking at ancient historical texts, looking at Herodotus and Pericles and all those, sort of older texts, particularly by the late 1600s and early 1700s. So, yes, it would have been religious, but not exclusively religious. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And there, like I said, there would have been geometry, there would have been arithmetic, there would have been other subjects interspersed. And that sort of goes to the last point here, right? This is not necessarily focusing only on Scottishness, and this is not only focusing really on religion, right? It is focusing on sort of broader historical trends and broader educational trends, sort of people reading larger texts and broader texts. And this all stems back to the Reformation. So let's talk a little bit about what the Reformation was, what it was like in Scotland, and how that gets us to what we're going to be discussing today. So the Reformation was, I'll toss this out to you. Can anybody tell us what was the Reformation? Tony, go ahead.
So the Reformation started in the I want to say early 1500s.
Excellent.
From Martin Luther, who posted, well, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but he used the Gutenberg printing press, posting his concerns and criticisms of the Catholic Church all over what would be, I believe, modern day Germany. And it caught on and it created a movement of creating new churches outside of the Catholic Church, which was unheard of because at the time the only churches was the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Excellent. That's very good. Very good, Tanya. It was called the 95 Theses. Excellent. So just to sort of sum up what Tony's saying and sort of bring that into Scotland. So in 1517, Martin Luther nails a 95 Theses and distributes a 95 Theses with his 95 disagreements with the Catholic Church. The end result there is a breakdown in the Catholic Church's supremacy and exclusive rights to religion in Europe. And as a result, you get breakups of different Protestant churches, particularly Lutheran, right? Martin Luther, Lutheran. But then you have others. And one such other is a guy named John Calvin, who lives in Geneva, which is what is part of today Switzerland. And he trains a young minister named John Knox. John Knox is educated in this Calvinist tradition and brings those ideas into Scotland, particularly into Edinburgh. And by about the 1550s or so, the Reformation has hit Scotland. When the Reformation comes to Scotland, there is a perspective that so one of the things that is very different between the Catholic Church and the Protestant denominations is that for the Catholic Church, particularly in the 1500s and arguably still into the 1900s, there is a closed access to the religion, meaning that for instance, the mass was in Latin, not in the vernacular. The major readings were done in Latin, not in the vernacular. But for John Knox and John Calvin and Martin Luther and everyone and a lot of the others who follow, they believed the average person should have access to education. The average person should be able to read the Bible. The average person should be able to understand scripture. And as a result of that, you need education systems to develop that type of study, right? You can't just learn that stuff on your own. Tony, go ahead.
So right now I'm actually taking a course on medieval Europe. And a big part of it about the Catholic Church, specifically going on your point of the Catholic Church limiting access to education, is that during the earlier to later Middle Ages, a large tactic of the church and different ecclesiastical authorities was that they would use the fact that only clerical workers were able to read and write, that they were literate. So all proceedings, all documents, any sort of legal agreements the church was involved in, because they were the only people that could read or write. So they used that to their advantage politically across Europe.
Sure, right, because they have to be, they're the only ones that are trained to sort of take the notes and such. Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. So it's not just religious control, it also comes into secular control as well, right? So through this, right, churches are established. Churches then, as I've said before, establish their own schools connected to this. And this helps to, again, democratize education, democratize religion, and break up that hegemony and break up that control that the Roman Catholic Church had, right? And I think Tony's point is a really, really important one, right? Because once you have eliminated the Catholic Church's domination of the only ones who can read, write, and record, and now average people can, well, now they can have jobs that were formerly locked off to them, if that makes sense. And so Tony's point's a really important one, I think. But it also goes back to the nature of the Presbyterian Church, right? And when we last saw each other 2 weeks ago, we looked at religion in the cities and we talked about the Presbyterian Church. And one of the things that I pointed out then was that within the Presbyterian Church, it is the local congregation, it is the local group of people that elect their minister. So it comes back to very significantly the role of that minister as a social figure, not just as a religious figure. And the religious identity, the Catholic identity, I should say, of all of the universities is stripped away. So like when the University of Glasgow was founded in 1451, it was founded as a Catholic institution. It was founded by a decree from the Pope. Well, by the time you get the Protestant Reformation 110 years later, it gets stripped away. The University of Edinburgh is the first university to be founded in Scotland after the Protestant Reformation. So it is very much a non-Catholic institution. And the parish school becomes the hub for this. And that local level of education becomes important. And again, I cannot stress enough the significance of the fact that this minister is educated, this minister already has to live there. So this minister then, sort of takes on this additional role. And that brings us to this. So in 1560, John Knox publishes what is called the Scottish Book of Discipline. It's sort of the basis of Scottish Presbyterianism. And in it, he lays out the importance of education. So I'm going to highlight the section I would like you to read. I guess, quite honestly, it's the whole thing, but so we're going to just read the necessity of schools. So if you could please read the section I've just highlighted. So John Knox, let me just their education, and they must know, they must be able to continue this religion further. But there's also another piece to it here. Where is it? The first sentence, right? The fruit and the commodity hereof shall suddenly appear. For first, the youth and tender children shall be nourished and be brought up in virtue. I want you to take a note of this word if you've made a copy of this document for yourself. Whenever virtue is talked about here, this is not virtue in the same way that we think of it here in 2022. Virtue here kind of means like sort of like the classical Roman view of sorry, Michael, I just saw that you said that he mentions the right way to pray and the true knowledge of Jesus. Yeah, right. So there's that religious significance as well. Virtue here means sort of social consciousness, the ability of a person to look towards the common good rather than personal good. Does that make sense? Right. So so what he's saying here is education gives you a view of the broader community and the importance to a broader group of people, not just oneself. And then finally, right, these larger schools called universities are supposed to be sort of the pinnacle of education. And again, he ends off that paragraph talking about virtue once again. So the importance here, right, is about civic education. It's about training people to have this social and religious function of not just being able to read the Bible, but also having sort of social connections and such. Moving forward, and I know a couple of people here are doing the Scottish Enlightenment for the essay that is due later this evening, so I anticipate some people having comments to say here. The Scottish universities become the hub of the Scottish Enlightenment, obviously, right? And the universities, as they emerge in the as they are founded in by the 1500s, and as they become significant, the significant hubs of the Enlightenment by the middle of the 1700s or even the early 1700s, it is important for us to remember their significance. One of the key identifying features of the Scottish Enlightenment is that a lot of the figures in the Scottish Enlightenment come from the universities, right? They might be ministers, and the names I have up here, like Hutcheson, Blair, and so that's Francis Hutcheson, Hugh Blair, and Adam Ferguson. they are all, and Thomas Reed are all ministers, but they're also university professors. So these universities become the basis for the Enlightenment in Scotland. And that is not entirely true for other parts of Europe. And, I think the point that Jeffrey brought up earlier, the fact that, education had led to increased literacy rates, which had led to the ability of more people to read, and thus sort of a basis for the Enlightenment to begin. That's an important thing for us to remember, right? There are better literacy rates in Scotland, which mean that more people have access to reading, and we can sort of keep this Enlightenment going. And the point here, Alexandra asked a little while ago about the how education was paid. Well, give me 1 second, Jeff. There were subscription fees. So instead of you paying a flat tuition, you paid based on what the professor charged, which meant that more people could go to school because they could sort of pick and choose their courses based on the amount of money they had, which again opens up the opportunities. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, and also I was going to add, because I know Devon made a point in the Enlightenment chapter where obviously a lot of these intellectuals, they were ministers or professors, and I guess a lot of the more liberal ones were getting positions because I think Devon said partly because of patronage and like friendships. So they were obviously, I guess more secular people getting positions too.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point, right? So that they have greater access to jobs because of their sort of more liberal views. Yeah, that's a great point. Good point. There's also emerging fields here, right? The sort of big three are moral philosophy, belles lettres, which is basically English literature, and medicine. So when we look at these subjects, right, you've all probably heard of moral philosophy. Maybe you haven't taken a course on moral philosophy, but you've probably heard of it. So Alexander, your point, you're saying that there are programs that still do this. It was really popular during 2020 in museums. What are you talking about?
So during 2020, Masterclass was actually like running a program like pay what you can for some of these classes, and also like teachers were like, there are a lot of online programs like Zoom had like guest lecturers that came on and offered like courses that you could sign up for, like pay as you want or if you want, and like New York museums have a pay what you want subscription type of thing where like the Met will just say if you want to give $5 to come in, you can give $5 and then pay for the experience.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I understand what you're saying now. Yeah, that's a great point. This was not necessarily pay what you want. It was more of the professor set the rate. But yeah, that's a good point. So you have the emergence of these new fields, right? So moral philosophy was not exactly what we think of it today in terms of like ethics. It was sort of more, how do people interact with one another, right? What is it that we do? What guides us to act in the way that we do? And Adam Smith is very famous for this, right? Adam Smith, who is the father of modern economics, right? The sort of father of modern capitalism, industrial capitalism. He is the one who he is a moral philosophy professor, but again, he talks a lot about economics and what drives a person. Belles lettres, the first professor of that is a guy named Hugh Blair, who studies literature. and sort of what makes literature beautiful. A couple of weeks ago, when we studied the romanticizing of the Highlands, I talked about the poetry of Ossian and James McPherson. Hugh Blair writes a whole book on analyzing the poetry in Ossian. Adam Ferguson, who is a professor of history, takes on a new study of history. There are 3 Alexander Monroes, Primus, Secundus, and Tertius, right? These Monroes study medicine, and they're the first ones to really start carving up cadavers and really studying medicine and sort of what the effect of different medicines are. Thomas Reid studies psychology and sort of what makes people people. So again, it's these different fields that are emerging here that are attracting people. Finally, the sort of big thing that makes Scotland different is they're doing all of this in English, which is an interesting thing, right? These university lectures are held in English. They're not held in Latin. They're not held in French, although French would have been less common anyway. They're not held in Latin, which would have been very common in the Low Countries, what would become the Netherlands and Belgium. It would be very common in England, but not in Scotland. It's in English, which also is important too, because it's English. It's the language of the empire. So it's important for us to see that. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, no, also about the English thing, because I incorporated that into my paper. I know Divine said that bringing in English as like the main language allowed for like more speculative teaching as well. And I guess a lot of that thought in the universities. So yeah, that's just something I figured I'd add.
Good, thank you. What do you mean by speculative teaching?
He said like it allowed more, I think it was discursive and discursive and speculative teaching.
Oh.
That's how like Divine put it in his
Yeah, right.
chapter.
You can have more arguments and more discussion, right? Because
Yeah.
more people could be involved in it. Yeah, excellent point. Again, one of the important things to see here, and one of the things that I'm, in my own professional research that I'm really interested in, is the democratization of education, right? It's access to education. It's how do we allow our students to become better acquainted with materials. So, sorry. So when we emerge out of the 1700s and we come into the 1800s, education in Scotland is world recognized as is becoming world recognized as a center for education. And it's one of the 3 institutions that Scotland is eligible to keep after the Union of 1707. It is tied to Protestantism. It is very much an urban institution. It is something that or maybe not urban, but it's very town centered, right? Because, well, it doesn't make sense to have a school. It doesn't make sense to have a school where no one can get there, or there is no one, right? So it's important for schools to be in urban environments. So by the time we get to the 19th century, Scotland, unlike many other parts of Europe and certainly many other parts of the world, have a great institutional understanding of education and have a very important role in education. And that primes Scotland to really catapult itself when we get into the 1800s. so that, when the Industrial Revolution occurs, as we've talked about in the past, you have a really smart and well-educated base of people that you can then use as your middle managers. And they can be your administrators, and they could be the people who are important to, the sort of management and operation of your building and of your factories. But there's also the spread of this type of education, so that when Scots go across the globe, whether they go to North America, United States, Canada, whether they go to Africa, whether they go to India, wherever they may go, they also establish schools on this model. So you get Presbyterian schools founded in the United States. So particularly places in Pennsylvania, New York, Tennessee, Connecticut, Boston, or I should say Massachusetts, New Jersey. You have a lot of these Presbyterian academies that are formed that become hubs of education. Within Scotland, there's an increase in literacy. So literacy is a really difficult thing to measure. Less so today, probably. But in the 19th century, and certainly for us studying it 150 years later, it's very difficult to figure out how to measure literacy. But literacy in this case, right, what we're using here and what Divine uses to measure literacy rates is people signing their names on marriage registers. And I think that's a good way for us to think of it, right? Being able to understand what you're signing, and that you can sign your name is a good way to sort of to think of that. So by the time you get into the 19th century, education again is well established. There are many schools. There are many schools throughout Scotland that already exist, which we've already talked quite extensively about. But the big law that's really important to us is the Education Act, the Scottish Education Act of 1872. This law entrenches, secures, and preserves Scottish education going forward. It ensures that students from every walk of life will be able to obtain an education. It ensures that it will be relatively inexpensive, if not free, and it allows for governmental control, and actually in many ways the sort of the professionalization of education. And again, we'll talk more about that in just a moment. By the mid 1800s, 25% of students are educated by Church of Scotland schools, but other religions do the rest, right? So you have not just the Church of Scotland, but you also have the Free Church, right? So you'll remember from last week, we talked about something called the Disruption of 1843, where you have the problem of patronage. You have the breakaway of the Free Church, which ultimately takes away a lot of those sort of middle-class people who are also those liberals. So there are many students who go to schools that are established by the Free Church. And so even within communities, right, even within communities, you have a Free Church school and a Church of Scotland school. And even within communities, particularly in the western portions of Scotland, you might have Catholic schools because by the mid 1800s, due to Catholic immigration, Irish immigration, due to the Great Famine and other reasons, you have Catholics desiring to better educate their flock. So there is better literacy, there's better education. And again, most of it, if not all of it, has religious undertones to it. So there's this chart that I have here on literacy rates in Britain generally. Then I have more specific, this is about England, but I think it still sort of helps us see the rising in literacy rates. So this is illiteracy rates, right? So how many people are illiterate? You know, in urban environments, right, you have a decent number of males who cannot write, but a very little cannot read, right? You're seeing 79% of people who can read. It's a pretty good percentage. Women, only 14% of women cannot read, which is just staggering. Oops, sorry. Again, if you look more regionally, in the South, this is looking more closely into the urban environments, right? 20% of people cannot read, which again, you're looking at, a huge reduction in the amount of illiteracy. Again, giving people better education, and the industrial revolution is going to help inspire that reading. And this excuse me, this chart sort of helps explain that a little bit more. So in 1872, there is a law passed, the Scottish Education Act, which requires, or I should say, makes education compulsory. It makes it a requirement that all children receive education from the ages of 5 to 12. More importantly, it also, again, makes it more English focused. Education cannot occur in Gaelic, which is an important thing to notice here, right? That they're forming a, they're trying to strip away sort of local identity. And again, well, we'll come back to that in a second. One of the pieces that Devine really, Tanya, sorry, can you say what that mean? What you mean by that? Which act? I'm sorry. What do you mean with the not having Gaelic in schools?
Sorry, I mean like the acts after the 1745, and they were trying to like get rid of Gaelic and stuff like that. So that was like still a thing even after they repealed the acts.
Yes. So the goal with this act said that all education and all instruction needed to be in English, and it's not necessarily so like the Disarming Act and all of those other acts after the 1745-46 rebellion. That's anti-Jacobite and that's anti-Highland because it is seen as sort of this insidious specter from the North. This is not necessarily about this is not necessarily, this is not about fears of the Highlander. It's really more of about like, we're training you for jobs to be productive for this country. This country speaks English, so we need you to speak English. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So it also formalizes attendance, right? Because it's required that students go to school, there must be attendance taken. What I thought was really interesting about the text, I'm sorry, about that appears in the textbook, and I had forgotten about until I reread it today. You know, or for today. You know, schools, you know, obviously, and we've thought about this obviously in the last 2 years, right? But schools, you know, schools provide an essential feature and an essential function, right? I mean, in terms of feeding children, in terms of giving access to mental health care and even just rudimentary nursing services, right? Schools provided that function, and we've learned that a lot over the last 2 years. But that was happening here, right? Like one of the things that Divine talks extensively about in the middle of the chapter, or maybe not extensively, but talks about, is like teachers were required to report if kids showed up without shoes on. You know, they provided social functions. There were teachers that had to check for lice in the hair. So, you know, those there's the important professional training, but there's also the important social, mental, physical health that we've become so accustomed to understanding today. And that's, you know, that's part of this here. So I want us to now turn our attention and look at the law itself. Okay, so I'm going to read just a portion of this here, and then I'm going to let you read it on your own. So, and whereas it is desirable to amend and extend the provision of the law of Scotland on the subject of education in such a manner that the means of procuring efficient education for their children may be furnished and may be available to the whole people of Scotland. All right, so we just want to make education available. Be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty. No, that's not where I want to. So then it goes into definitions, right? So we've talked about the parish school. Parish school, parish, shall mean any parish which does not wholly consist of a borough or part of a borough within the meaning of this act, and shall include any school district formed under this act, right? So parish sort of has this smaller unit piece to it. A borough is a borough town returning or contributing as a borough to return a member to parliament. So they are represented as such. Okay. So this is what I would like you to do. I would like you to read the section that I have highlighted, right? I would like you to sort of point out, right? What is it that this bill, this act is prescribing to the Scottish Department of Education, or it's just Scottish Education Department? What's the goal of it? What powers does it have? And how is it being paid for? So what are the powers of the Scottish Education Department? What are the powers? How is it being paid for? What's its purpose? Is that, sorry, you know, there is greater access to education for women. So young girls, although education before the 19th century was limited almost exclusively to men, for young girls, that changes here in the 19th century. So that by the time we get to the Scottish Education Act of 1872, young girls are allowed to go to school. And it's a way to, again, for the UK, for Britain, or even just Scotland in general, to get greater, to help catch up to other parts of Europe, right? By the late 1800s, there is a lot of competition between the British and the Germans. Anybody here who has taken History 102 or any of the other history courses of Europe in the 19th century will be very well familiar with the fact that Britain and Germany are major competitors up through the 19th century. Go ahead, Tony.
So yeah, that actually goes into my paper where my paper is about the Scottish shipbuilding industry, specifically in Glasgow and the Clyde River. And a big part of that was the naval arms race between the British Empire and the Germans. Created a very large market for the Scottish shipbuilders.
Excellent. That's a great point. Right. So it's not just so the competition, the global competition that is going on, whether it's military or educationally, there is this view that Britain and Germany must compete, and that sort of helps spur on this path towards women's education. Women are not just trained sort of what we would say is home studies anymore, right? Sort of kitchen management and household finance management, but they're being taught how to read, write, and speak and do arithmetic, just as their male counterparts are learning. And this is part of a global trend in the late 1800s that is called maternal feminism. So I'm sure those of you who are fans of American history have heard of maybe first wave feminism or second wave feminism. And first wave feminism is the feminism that we see in the 19th century. And the argument that maternal feminism makes is that, if women are supposed to be, men are saying that women are supposed to be the nurturers of the children. And as such, right, they don't need education because they're the nurturers. But women flip that, and maternal feminism as a stance flips that. And instead what it says is, well, if women are supposed to be the nurturers and the carers of the children, isn't it then the women's job to also educate and teach the young children how to read and write? So then isn't it important for women to know how to read, write, and do arithmetic? And this becomes part of that argument. And it is one of the things that helps spur along women's access to education and women's access to more opportunity. Tony, go ahead.
So when you were comparing to the United States, I remember from a while ago in a history class learning about how after the American Revolution that women were given the title. I don't remember exactly what the title was. It was something like Patriot Mother, something along those lines, where it was declared that it was a woman's duty to teach their children about democracy.
Yeah, and that's an important piece to remember too, right? That for in the United States, right, women are given this sort of exalted role to sort of better to help train their children, right? But when at least in the United States example, in the late 1700s, they're not given a ton of rights to help achieve that. That changes 100 years later, right? And that will change 50 years later when women are given the right to vote in both Britain and in the United States. Yeah, good point, Tony. Within Scotland, secondary education is not necessarily as highlighted in the Education Act of 1872. And the reason for that is the sort of crucial nature of primary education was seen, right? The ability to read, write, do arithmetic, and as a function of economic output and such, what was key. But there were, for those rising middle class people and for those rising middle managers, there was a lot of desire for them, for their children, to attend academies or colleges, as they would have been called here, to help advance them and prepare them for university study, and ultimately into the more professional careers and things like education itself, law, medicine, and so on. One of the things that I always think is interesting, right, when we discuss things like the Enlightenment and people who did, like David Hume or Adam Smith for the first paper, or people who maybe did the Enlightenment for this paper, right? One of the things that people always are staggered by is the fact that, like, a guy like David Hume went to university at the age of like 12 or 13. Adam Smith went at the age of 14. And all these young men, all these men are going to universities at exceptionally young ages. That was not uncommon in the mid 1700s or the early 1700s. But by the time we get 150 years later to the late 19th century, that is changing. And for people who desire to go to a university, there needs to be some sort of refining that goes on between primary education and secondary education. Primary education and university college education. And that's where these academies come in. So you'll remember, I hope, that when we talked about 2 weeks ago, we talked about the changes to urban environments and the changes that, the popping up of those suburban communities. One of the things that I talked about was that these were places for the new middle class folk to go. So you have the emergence of these new academies in these territories, in these middle class neighborhoods, right? So Kelvinside Academy. Kelvinside Academy is established in the west end of Glasgow, near that new sort of middle class area, the Botanic Gardens, if you remember the image I showed you the other day. St. Leonard's and St. Leonard's, which is in St. Andrews, again in a more middle class suburb of the town of St. Andrews, and St. George in Edinburgh, which is in the new town section, which is on the northern side of Edinburgh. This is a way for these new middle class people to set themselves apart, and in a way for them to sort of prepare their children for their professional careers, access to university and such. For the middle class, though, it was also seen as a way of sieving out or separating themselves from the lower classes, right? It was a way of helping to make themselves a little bit apart in this period. And that sort of helps us catapult to the universities. By the time we get to the late 19th century, education within the universities of Scotland had become a very closed structure, right? So in terms of a community or an education institution that was once so open, so democratized, that changes here by the time we get to the late 1800s. Because of those subscription fees, because of opportunity costs, because of whatever the case indeed might be, the middle and the sort of the lower classes and the lower middle classes could not afford, either in real terms or in opportunity, for their children to go to school. And there was a big criticism over that. The professionalization of the middle class, right, also helps to lead that. And it helps to lead to sort of more formal education and access to greater sort of types of degrees. So one of the things that happens here, right, is that there is more formal medical training, where a medical degree becomes a graduate degree. So it's a degree that now somebody has to go through first studies at a college or university, and then pivot into sort of postgraduate or graduate medical education. Business degrees and business studies become important, become degrees that people can achieve and people can get. And for the for the young men and women of young men of Scotland, there is a greater attention and a greater focus given to institutions within Scotland, so that people don't have to go south of the border, or people don't have to go to the continent, to France or wherever, to get their degrees. There's also new programs and new chairs of programs established, so that there's a new Scottish Studies chair, a history chair, a business chair, a political economy, and English studies. All of these emerge here in the late 19th century. Again, there's a professionalization that's coming along with this. There is a desire for people to become better educated. Finally, and this is sort of the part where we will end, there's greater connection here to professionalization, to businesses, to institutions, right? The Carnegie Trust. So Andrew Carnegie, who moves here to the United States and to New York in the mid 1800s, helps to establish scholarships to Scottish universities. So I've mentioned to you before, right, that I studied in Scotland in 2007 and 2008. The way that I was able to do that is I got a scholarship through an organization like the Carnegie Trust, right? It wasn't the Carnegie Trust. It was a society called the St. Andrews Society. And there are a lot of different societies that offered opportunities for young Scottish people, or young men and women in particular, to go to Scottish universities. No, I didn't have to be Scottish to get the scholarship I got, but that may have been the case 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So you can see here, right, as we come to the conclusion of tonight's lecture, right, that education within Scotland, has a really long history. It is not just the story of the 19th century. It's not just a story of the Scottish Enlightenment. The sort of long trajectory of Scottish education is that it starts with the borough school, with the parish schools, with the parochial schools, the local level, and the great institutions there. And again, it's religious in nature, right? It's training people to read the Bible. It's training people to be virtuous, right? And by virtuous, again, I mean that sort of classical Roman perspective. It's training people to be again, to have a religious perspective, right? And to have a devotion to Christianity. But that changes when we get to things like the Enlightenment, or it changes by the time we get to the end of the 1700s. And we start to see that it's not just about religious training any longer. It's focusing on what useful skills can people have. And then finally, when we look at by the law that's passed in 1872, it's the absorption of those religious institutions into the Scottish Education Department. It's absorption of the role of education, and it's seen. I guess the important piece to see here is education is viewed for its social importance. Think about, I would love, if you, we're not going to have this conversation now, but like, I want you to think about this for a second. Students can attend religious schools that are paid for by the government. That would never happen here in the United States, right? But that's allowed in Scotland, and stretching all the way back to the 19th century, that's allowed. So it's important for us to see, right, that the role of education, the significance of education is understood here in the 1870s. All righty, so